As a nurse, I've seen a lot of strange things, especially working the night shift at our small-town clinic, but nothing compares to what happened last October. I'll never forget it, no matter how much I'd like to. It was around 2 a.m., and I was finishing up my paperwork when the buzzer startled me out of my tired haze. A man stood outside the clinic door, drenched and looking desperate. I tried to ignore the unease that prickled at my skin as I opened the door and let him in. He was tall and thin, but something about his movements felt wrong, like he was putting on a performance. His eyes darted around as he limped through the doorway, grimacing. I offered him a chair, trying to put on my best reassuring smile. "What's the problem tonight?" I asked. He looked up at me, his eyes strangely intense under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Cut," he said, holding up his hand. I noticed a dark, sticky stain spreading from beneath the ragged bandages wrapped around it. I quickly gathered my supplies and guided him into the treatment room. The air was thick with an odd metallic smell that wasn't just blood. I set out my instruments and asked him to remove the bandages. His fingers trembled as he pulled the bandages back, and that's when I saw the wound. It was deep, much deeper than any accidental cut. The flesh gaped open, raw and dark, like it had been deliberately torn. But what made my stomach lurch was the almost rhythmic movement beneath the skin, as if something were shifting just out of sight. "How did this happen?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on me, a thin smile stretching across his face. "You won't believe me if I tell you," he said softly, almost like he was daring me to ask. I ignored the chill creeping up my spine and started to clean the wound. As I worked, he kept talking, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't cut myself. Not really. I was chosen." My hands froze. "Chosen? What do you mean?" His grin widened, and his teeth looked unnaturally sharp in the harsh light. "They marked me," he whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "They said I'm theirs now." "They?" I asked. "Who are they?" He stared at me for a long moment, a look of confusion coming over his face. Then he cocked his head to the side as if listening to something that only he could hear. A moment later, he glanced up at me with those haunting eyes, a dark grin creasing the corner of his mouth, and said, "They're speaking. Can't you hear them?" I felt like I was caught in a nightmare, unable to wake up. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but professionalism held me in place. Then he did something that turned my blood to ice. He reached out, touching my arm with his uninjured hand, his grip vice-like. "You should come too. They like helpers." I recoiled, his touch leaving an unnatural warmth, like a burn. I knew I needed to finish this and get him out of the clinic. I wrapped his hand tightly, my eyes avoiding his unsettling gaze as he stared at me. His smile grew wider with each movement of my hands. Finally, I finished. I mumbled instructions, practically shoved him out the door, slammed it shut, and locked it. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. But as I watched him through the glass, he didn't walk away. He just stood there, staring in at me, his face lit by the dim, flickering street lamp outside. That same chilling smile stretched across his face, broader than before, like he'd won some game I didn't know I was playing. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and I felt a thick tension in the air, pressing down on me. His hand, the one I'd just bandaged, slowly rose up to the window, pressing against the glass. He dragged his palm down slowly, leaving a dark streak. I realized, horrified, that it was blood. The lights overhead began to flicker, casting the room in erratic bursts of shadow. And with each flicker, it was as if he was closer to the glass. His face pressed against it, his eyes wild with that unhinged stare. I stumbled back, panic rising like bile in my throat. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The clinic was deathly silent except for my breathing, which came in shallow, ragged gasps. I could feel him somehow, just outside. I didn't know if he was still at the window, but I could sense his presence like a heavy, chilling weight. I felt his gaze penetrating the darkness, his eyes hunting me even though he was nowhere to be seen. I needed to leave. I made my way toward the staff exit, careful to make no sound. But as I reached for the door, I froze. The handle was warm, uncomfortably so, as if someone had just been holding it. And then, just beyond the door, I heard it. A faint whisper, his voice winding through the silence. "Let me in, nurse. They want you, too." His words slithered into my mind, like they were burrowing deep into my thoughts. I pressed my back against the door, as far from the handle as I could get, and closed my eyes, praying this was some kind of nightmare. But then, a heavy thud hit the door, hard enough to make it rattle on its hinges. Another, louder this time, accompanied by his voice, closer and more insistent. "I'll come back for you. We'll be waiting," he murmured, his voice a guttural rasp. I don't remember much of what happened next, only that I ran as fast as my legs would take me, bursting out of the clinic's front doors and into the night air. The streets were empty, silent, and every shadow seemed to hide that twisted smile, those watching eyes. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The warmth on my arm where he'd touched me only grew, burning hotter with each passing night. And then, one morning, I noticed a strange mark on my skin, a thin, jagged line, deep and red, almost like a scar I didn't remember getting. There was something else, something disturbing. It felt like something was crawling beneath my skin, just below the mark, just like his skin beneath the open wound. I couldn't stop scratching my arm, and at times I wanted to take a knife and cut into the spot where he touched me and carve it away from my body, just so I could get at whatever was pulsating beneath it. Then, one day, it stopped, but the mark still remained. I left the clinic soon after that, but the nightmares never stopped, and some nights, when I'm alone, I still hear his voice, faint and whispering from somewhere far too close. "They want you, too."